Let's take a look at today's piece of OtakuDaiKun fan art. Whoa, it's a rather buff Daikun. Gotta say, abs like that are quite the achievement. Makes me want to try and earn them myself. Easier said than done, right? Thank you so much, Ariane. Welcome back to OtakuDaiKun. Dai-chan here. This current season, we've got examples of both gorgeous and horrendous uses of 3D CG in anime. On one end, we've got shows like Beastars and my personal favorite, D4DJ. These shows prove to me that the anime industry has finally mastered 3D, using it to create visuals that 2D animation simply can't. There are anime that I feel are better off in 3D, no matter how much effort goes into a hand-drawn alternative. On the other hand, we've got shows like Crunchyroll's X-Arm, which is currently the laughingstock of the internet. It's a series that looks like, at best, it'd make a decent student demo reel, but it's being sold to us as an official production. For today's video, I want to talk about why I think some of these anime succeed while others fall flat. Now, I've already made a video on the topic titled CG Atrocities in Anime, and there are a lot of relevant points I make in it. It mainly focuses on how frustrating it is to see CG ruin an otherwise solid 2D production. However, I didn't spend nearly enough time going over what actually works about 3D anime. Obviously, there are some uses of 3D that work brilliantly, and after looking at quite a few of them, I think I've identified a handful of things that studios can implement and things they should avoid. The first thing I want to point out is that, deep down, anime fans don't necessarily have an aversion to 3D in anime. Not at all. Rather, we just want good anime, no matter how it's made. Thanks to this, animators looking to use 3D need to ask themselves why. What is the reason for using 3D instead of hand-drawn 2D, which is oftentimes received far more favorably? The answer to that question should be that 3D will make for a more visually stimulating product. This is why a 3D CG adaptation of Berserk is never going to work. The manga's insanely detailed hand-drawn panels just can't be done justice by 3D models. Even with the best 3D artists on the planet, which they certainly didn't have, Berserk is such an earthy, analog narrative that conflicts with the clean smoothness 3D provides. Nobody chose 3D for Berserk because it was the right aesthetic choice. The obvious reason most 3D anime is frowned upon, sadly, is because that answer is more often than not to save money or labor. That's what leads to atrocities like awkward CG dragons, or CG body doubles used in the background, yet we can still tell they're 3D from a mile away. CG may have allowed Peter Jackson to deliver giant war scenes with Massive, but to get away with that in anime requires just as much dedication. In other words, 3D should never be used as a crutch. It kinda sucks hearing this, given how crappy the industry is to its animators, most of whom are severely overworked and underpaid. But for this video in particular, we'll be focusing on what makes for better-looking anime, and not necessarily anime that's easier to make. Not everyone has the time or budget to bring us Miyazaki-tier animation, but maybe that's the consensus from fans, that we'd rather have fewer shows of quality than tons of unpolished ones. It's funny that anime struggles with 3D so much, considering video games have been knocking it out of the park for the last 2 decades. In their case, they had to use 3D in order to take advantage of modern gaming mechanics. And so, rather than accepting 3D as a cheaper alternative, developers continued to push the medium to make better and better visuals. Now, studios are either polishing obviously 3D models to look as beautiful as can be, or using a myriad of techniques to mimic a hand-drawn aesthetic in a 3D environment. In either case, the goal is to create stunning visuals, not cut corners. Most televised anime, however, still can't seem to decide whether it wants to be 3D or not, and you'll see this horrible blending of 2D and 3D. It's a cardinal sin of CG anime. Never mix 2D and 3D assets in the same shot. I'm not referring to special effects, such as fancy camera work or particles. Rather, I'm referring to characters and the objects they interact with. I'm also not saying it can't be done, just that great care needs to be taken to avoid it from being jarring or noticeable. Thus, here are some things more impressive anime take advantage of to avoid this sin. Attempt to limit the use of 3D to inorganic objects, such as mechs or cars. Take special care when rendering environments so it doesn't look like the 2D characters and 3D assets exist in separate worlds. If you absolutely have to add an organic 3D character alongside 2D ones, you need to make sure the 2D animation is both smooth and superbly detailed to minimize the contrast. If you intend to use 3D extras, use techniques such as depth of field or lighting to obscure them from view. Keep them far away from the camera, far enough that we can't make out any details. Obviously, the render quality of the 3D assets is critical as well. Cell shading, also called toon shading, helps make 3D models look more like they're hand-drawn, though it's worth noting the difference is always easy to spot. The way these assets move can also conflict with the 2D elements. Even the most gorgeous anime are animated at 24 frames per second, and even then, the majority of those frames are shot on 2s, meaning the 2D characters only change poses every other frame. This means that most of the anime we look at appears to be moving at 12 frames per second, which is quite jarring for 3D since it relies on smooth keyframes. You don't want a smooth 3D character interacting with a jagged 2D one, which is sadly what X-Arm is prone to doing. The anime that handle this best bridge the gap by increasing the drawn frames of 2D assets while lowering the frame rate of the 3D ones. Still, it's not simply a matter of trimming out every other frame from the 3D. You gotta be very deliberate about which frames you keep and which ones you remove. Anime is strange in that a lot of its impact still comes from stillness. Even in the most fluid of animations, we'll see a lot of key moments that focus our attention. Think of it like bullet time in the Matrix films. The movement breathes, getting slower and faster depending on what you want to emphasize. Conveniently, this doesn't just apply to marrying 3D and 2D animation. All good animation does this, and I think that's kind of the point. Going back to what I said earlier, we don't hate 3D so much as we just want good anime. If the 3D looks good, nobody's gonna complain. The trick to this is that many times, well-made 3D animation takes just as much effort and discipline as quality 2D animation. My previous video on this topic spoke a lot about anime's early digital era when hand-painted cells were replaced by digital coloring. Studios flocked to the new technology for its financial benefits, but it took them a while to fully utilize all the techniques they'd mastered before. The unique atmospheres and dynamic lighting they'd mastered on cells, the rich textures and sharp line work that came with that technique, these were absent from the earliest digital anime. It looked too clean, bright, and bland. Eventually, though, artists began to master the new tech to create the same quality art they had before. The same exact process has happened for 3D. Shows like X-Arm might be using 3D only in its barest form, but other studios have found ways of using 3D to be just as expressive, if not more so, than 2D. The musical anime D4DJ, available for free on YouTube by the way, does a handful of amazing things that I want to emphasize. It follows in the same legacy as anime like Love Live and Bang Dream, which experiment with 3D models to avoid having to draw complex dance sequences. Love Live would use it to support 2D animation in the foreground to distract you from the dancers in the back, which worked okay. Other idol anime don't even bother doing that, however, and suffer from what I call lifeless doll syndrome. Oftentimes, these stand-in models don't feel like fully living people, but rather puppets with the same uncanny morbidity as Chuck E. Cheese animatronics. Even if you animate these models exactly as you would their 2D counterparts, they still might not have enough emotion to come to life. Thus, I've noticed a general rule that 3D anime has a higher burden of emotion to convince viewers they're not looking at dolls. In other words, 3D anime needs more exaggerated motions and expressions to avoid looking stiff. I believe D4DJ's protagonist Rinku was designed with this rule in mind. She is one of the most extroverted and bubbly anime characters out there, and I feel this was a deliberate design choice for the fact that D4DJ is almost entirely 3D. Everything from her constant cheer to her iconic "happy around" catchphrase help keep the visuals and pacing from falling into lifeless doll syndrome like its other dance idol contemporaries. On the other hand, sometimes less is more. Just because 3D allows us to show vast set pieces in real time through all manner of moving cameras, that doesn't mean it's best to show us all of that. Traditional anime learned from its limitations to create iconic visuals through patterns, depth of field, motion graphics, and other stylistic flourishes. The opening of D4DJ utilizes the same techniques, particularly in this segment featuring Kyoko from Piki Piki and Saki from Photon Maiden. The set is lit to emphasize the two musicians, despite the fact that they're surrounded by a cheering crowd. That crowd, which likely lacks the same detail as the main characters, blends into the scene by being shrouded in darkness. Another fun technique they use in this segment is adding an overlay filter so that the shadows look like screen tone, creating a more striking texture. It's the same technique used in Valkyria Chronicles to make its 3D world look as though it were sketched. It's also nice seeing D4DJ utilizing some of the classical comedy gestures traditional anime pioneered. Things like swiping wind effects, silly faces, sweat drops, that sort of thing. It's a reminder to us that, oh yeah, this counts as anime just like everything else we watch. This is used to great effect in the anime's end credits, where Maho is jamming out to one of her mixes. She bounces around like a top, and when the hype gets real, her eyes go all emoji and it's just so adorable. It's pretty clear to me that D4DJ has a solid handle on what it's doing, creating a 3D anime full of amazing dance numbers, while maintaining a highly expressive visual style that truly breaks free of most all the setbacks and inhibitions we typically have about 3D. They're here to dominate the 3D scene, and their declaration of war is this charming T-pose. To sum things up, anime is defined by style more than technique. No matter what tools you use, you've got to bring characters to life with cinematic prowess and narrative integrity. While a lot of 3D in anime looks bad because it's used as a crutch, we've finally reached a point where 3D anime can truly shine just as well as it did in video games. On that note, what are your favorite 3D anime or video games that utilize an anime aesthetic? What techniques do they use that you find compelling and engaging? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoy this channel, help me beat the algorithm by liking, commenting, and sharing the video, subscribing to OtakuDaiKun, and, most of all, smashing that notification bell so you don't miss out on all of my anime discussion, lore, or Let's Play content. If you want to support me directly, there are now 3 ways that all provide the same benefits. You can click Join here on YouTube, or join Patreon or Subscribestar for access to exclusive vids and early access. As always, celebrate your fandom.